yeah, we might see how much legs that's got. I don't know how much people talk about distillery character.
I think more and more it is becoming the trend is because previously, whenever it came to whiskey, they were more about regional because many big distilleries had multiple distilleries, right? That's why they regionalized themselves. But now that, we have got individual companies have their own distilleries, that's why it is becoming more prevalent to talk about the distillery character. And you'll see the bigger distilleries have started doing the same as well.
So you're saying that in that period, so if we wind back to the beginning of whiskey time, you would have had independent people starting a distillery and making their own spirit whiskey and probably selling it locally, and then the more successful ones selling it more regionally. And each one of those might have had their own style or whatever. And then if you wind forward to, need to check, but maybe 80s, 90s, early 2000s, might be as recent as that, the kind of consolidation in the industry where the likes of what is now Diageo or Pernod Ricard or others, we kind of started actually. I saw the hand coming across. I don't know whether
your glass is perfectly in frame. You just
yeah. So if I start that again, to rewind back to the beginning of time, you'd have had people probably living near farms who started their distillery and were making spirit or whiskey, selling it, locally and probably for their own consumption. And those that were more successful then start selling more broadly. And then you wind forward to more recent period where you start to get consolidation. The what is now a Diageo and Pernod Ricard and those big conglomerates start buying up all of those distilleries, closing lots of them down, and consolidating. And what you're saying is that in that phase of whiskey's development, that's where you get this kind of regionalization, and whiskey starting to be identified by whether they're Speyside, Islay, Highland, Lowland, etc.
It is, yeah. So it is exactly right. So that is why I think it's still they are still done like that. For example, when you try something, you said, "Oh yeah, it's a classic Speyside."
Yeah.
Or it's a classic Highland. It's a classic Lowland, because that's how the industry was pushing the liquid out. Because they had so many distilleries in the portfolio, majority of them was used for blends to capture the volume market. So they were not that much, I will think, they were not that much thinking that they have to sell their individual distillery character, because it was bringing revenue anyway. But now the interest is...
Well, if I can stop, actually, you might even go further, because what they were doing was building individual brands, and the brand, because they had grown so much, because it's a kind of a concentration of all of their marketing effort into a name, what the amount of liquid that name requires means that it is, lots of different distilleries have got to contribute to that.
Absolutely.
So
correct,
per definition, you lose distillery character
Absolutely.
in the world of whiskey.
Yeah, you have got the brand character. That's why, yeah. But then when the time started, the start of time, the distillery character was there. And you see some of the brands, they carried that. For example, I think one of the biggest brand which pushed the distillery character at the start of time was Glenfiddich, as an example, right? Those guys. And then Glen Grant, they took their distillery character to the world, say that, listen, we are whiskey makers, try our whiskey. Yeah. And they carried on. That's why I think from that point of view, as an example, one of the example is where you still see the biggest volume what they do is their distillery. For example, Glenfiddich 12 or 15. That is one of the major ones that they try to sell still now. So that is a good example of distillery character where the volumes are pushed towards distillery character. Same in the way, if you think about Talisker when it comes to Diageo's portfolio, okay, they're pushing the Talisker distillery character like that because it has been from the start itself made as an individual character. Small volumes, but again, the volume comes into picture. They're able to do that because the volumes that they had in mind for those distilleries are small, that they can be achieved by one distillery.
Yeah, and I guess obviously in a way, even what I've done in this conversation is conflated blend with single malts. So, you per definition lose distillery character in a blended whiskey, which is where, let's say, a huge amount of the marketing money has gone and building those brands. And then what you've got is the selection, almost like hero single malts, where there you've got a distillery character that is being presented and pushed through the single malts. So with that kind of loss of emphasis of distillery character, except in the instance of single malts, you're saying that distillery character is coming back as a theme.
It is coming back. I think because I think for every distillery, big or small, they understand now the value of their home. Okay, because people have started recognizing the provenance as an element. Okay, where it is produced, where the liquid is coming from. This is why you'll see even the bigger ones, they have started releasing their home distillery brands going out more and more, visible more and more.
Where do you think that's driven? I mean, you kind of, one of the markets, one of the countries where, you've got a massive proliferation of craft distilleries would be the US, and that is, undoubtedly helped by their tax regime. That you get tax breaks if you're a small distillery, which wish we had here.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think there's that international influence, or that has driven that interest in, distinguishable, places where whiskey is made, and it's made in a certain way, so it's got a character? Or do you think, or was that, was that happening in say Scotland anyway?
I would think, it's my thinking, is when, first of all, as you said, it was very brand driven before, is because it is a volume brand driven. They are talking about, right, let's aim to please that many people, and you can't really do single distilleries. But then more and more they have realized when the auctioning of the whiskey started, okay, it wasn't that prevalent 40 years ago, auctioning, right? In the last 20 years, it's been huge. That the big distilleries would realize, or their financial directors would already know it, but they couldn't help it, know that the value of those individual distillery as casks or individual bottle releases are far more as a value than what is its value as a volume sale. So this is why what they're now doing is creating for example, again, going back to Diageo, Diageo has got brands which is for volume, and Diageo has got something called reserves, the
Yeah.
reserves category. Now that is a huge, as a brand value itself has got higher value in worth than what the big brand volume is doing money-wise, right? So this is why I think now it is becoming more and more, you see, they're pushing those brands out to bring people's attention, because their cask value is now increasing so much because of these auctions and all these things. So as a reserve, for example, you're a CEO of a multi-million company, you don't want to, how much ever expensive a blue label is, how much ever rare, you don't want to buy a blue label to show off in the board. You will go to the reserve section, say, you know what, I'm going to buy one cask for my company. Oh yeah, it's a £1 million cask, it's not a problem. So things like that. Those individual distillery, their product, now the distillery character, has got a much higher value, not in cash, but in, what do you call that, brand value wise.
So what is distillery character? I mean, what you've just described to me sounds also more like branding.
It is branding. I mean, as I said, every distillery has its own character by innate nature, because the equipment are different.
Yeah.
It will come out different anyway. But what I mean is like how different distillery, because of their brand character, and then and actual genuine story behind of creation, it can draw certain people to it. Okay, and the flavor can draw certain people to it. So that creates a value, because that can only be found in that distillery, right? Sometimes distillery finds its character, sometimes a character is created in that distillery. So whatever that is, that character is very unique to it. So for example, for Mast House, we curated our character, right? We said we are looking to make this distillery's spirit coming out of a fruity floral. We designed every process around it to make that happen, okay? We have certain characters in our spirit that people, when they try it, they wonder, how did you create that flavor? Because that has not been found before in any other whiskies, okay? That is because it has been, our brewing process has been designed specifically to create that flavor that we capture later. So that's what I think the distillery character is, what it has found itself or what has been created, but now it has been pushed forward to people, saying that, by the way, for example, Cardew is for always been a big part for Blue Label, but itself had a beautiful flavor, that is also very high in esters, okay? How it is produced, I do not know the intricacies of it, but it has got that character. At the same way, if you think about another distillery, Cragganmore, it has its own character. Now it has got different stills. So Cragganmore is a little bit, slightly more oily, not as oily as Clynelish, okay? But all the flavor, like Clynelish is very heavy oil, and now you find a sherry cask Clynelish, it's beautifully drinkable, right? But a lot of thing has gone into blends before, okay? But now people are finding that they can associate their likingness of those flavor to very specific distilleries. Now, previously it was not, because it was all gone into a blend. So that is the distillery character now people are now privy to, and if they can own cask, that is much more as a value. When I say value, I mean worth more to people than what they can get from a brand, a big brand whiskey, which doesn't have its roots to one home.
Yeah, it's the economist in me is that's utility.
Yeah, true, exactly.
It's not only economic, but it's the well-being. It's your how close you feel to the brand and so on and so forth. So distillery character then. So what are the components, or I mean, you're in a position where you, as you say, curated or created a distillery character based on something that we felt we would like, and that would resonate with people. So what are the levers that you've got to pull? What levers are available to you when you are creating a distillery character? So if I look at it from the other way around, for let's say the traditional distilleries like the Cardews or whatever, those are not curated, but there is something in there where you could look back and you could say, okay, the reason that this distillery has got this character is probably, if you look back down through the process, there's an element of the mash, or there's an element of so what are the levers available, and then how can, if I'm drinking a whiskey, how can I identify where a distillery character is coming from?
So when we started this place, we looked into brewing process quite hugely, okay, because that is the first lever. It was like, say, listen, breweries, what they do, they create flavors, because what they're going to drink is what they're brewing, right? They do not rely on distillation. They do not rely on barrels to give the flavor to it. Whatever they are brewing during the process is the flavor creation. So we said, right, if we want to create a flavor, first thing we need to look in there. And the first thing breweries look into is their raw materials, right? They choose specific malt for specific flavor. So we said, right, what we're looking for is a very slight honey oat kind of flavors to start with, to make the fruity floral element. So it's like, right, so we do not really want a distiller's malt, okay, but we want a pale malt kind of thing. So the malt become one of the drivers, and the other grains that we have in our recipe. So the grain selection, the first big important part. Second is the brewing.
So let's just wind back. So are there any other whiskies out there that you can think of where when you taste them, you can kind of trace back to them perhaps looking at grain selection?
Whiskey-wise, we have seen few big distilleries also released some examples, specific variety of barley that they used for flavor purposes. For example, many people use Golden Promise or Marisota. It is an old-style brewing flavor that comes through. It's a honey oaty element.
Right.
Okay. So some people has done it, but many big distilleries are getting just standard distiller's malt. So it is very difficult to find. But I still remember.
So these would be more like craft distilleries, more likely to
craft
be
distilleries, doing that. I think I remember something very small. One of the smallest Scottish distillery, they were releasing one product because they very much wanted the flavor of Marisota to come through. So they did that new make, and I'm trying the new make, and I can see that how the barley variety can make so much difference. So that is why when we're doing it, we said, no, we need to make sure that what the barley we're using, how it is malted. Okay, the standard of the malting is quite important for us. So that is one of the lever. That's why as a grain. Then the brewing, as I said, brewing process. If breweries are able to create distinctive different beers by using different malt and brewing techniques, we need to look into that brewing techniques. This is why at Copper Rivet Mast House we have got a brewing type brew house, 2-vessel system. When we do temperature profiling in one, then another one is to separate the liquid. So that is another thing, that way you brew it, temperature profiling. Then I have tried whiskies from different distilleries, and they have got different water profiles in a way. Sparge water profile. Some people, majority of the distillery has got a practice, which is a very common practice, which makes also sense because of the extract potential, is when we are brewing and take the first liquid out, the wort, there is still a lot of sugar and starch left in the grain. So we spray more water called the sparge water. So the more and more water you spray, the more it leaches out the starch and sugars from it. But because you're trying to extract all the sugars out. So different distilleries will have 3 waters or 4 waters, and sometimes 5 waters. And what I felt, I've tried different distilleries who've got different kind of waters, and I felt the distilleries who's got multiple waters.
You need to explain what do you mean by what multiple waters.
So
what
when you mash it,
what actually happens? So we're at a stage where we've got the grain and we've got hot water, and we're basically mixing them in order to extract the starch from the grain.
yeah. So first of all, mixing it to convert the starch to sugar, doing the temperature profiling for that, and then once the starch has been converted to sugar in that liquid, we collect that. That is the water that we say it's strike water, goes straight into the fermenter. But there is still a lot of sugar left in the grain, so we spray hotter water on it, okay, called the sparge water, that draws more sugar, which is still cling to the grain, out. So that is the first sparge water. We also collect that water. But then other distillery will have second and third sparge water. So they will spray more and more to extract as much sugar out from the grain, so there is nothing left in the grain, right? Because if there is sugar left in the grain, that is a waste of money, there's sugar. So there are different distilleries who has got second, third, fourth waters in there. And I've tried many of the new makes, and I always felt they had got more malty, dry notes, because of, I think, a lot of tannins get drawn through, and as well, it's not really sugar you're drawing, right? There are other things, proteins and all, which is there, get dragged into. And also, they hold that liquid. So second, third, or fourth water are not goes into fermentation straight away. They are held and then used as the strike water for the next brew. So you're not losing any sugar, right? That holding process has implications as well. How you hold it. If you don't hold it at a higher temperature, you will have microbe growing on it. So it does become a bit of out of control, I feel sometimes. But what I felt at that time, analyzing all these different new makes of whiskies from different distilleries, has got those different kind of water profiles, is it creates a certain flavor, maltier, that did not fit to our distillery character. So that is also now one of the handle that we actually monitor. Say, like, we do not want to have too much of sparge water. Not only that, how much is the sparge water also is quite an important thing. Okay, so strike water and sparge water is the complete water. If you think for 500 kilograms of grains, typically you'll be using around 2,900, let's say. 550 of that water is absorbed in the grain, goes into the spent grain. So you collect the rest. So that 2,900 we played with to see where the flavor lies. If we mash it with less amount of water and have too much sparge water, what it does to the flavor.
Yeah.
The same way, all these different elements we have studied to see if we do 2,000 liters at mashing water and only 900 liters of sparge, what is the flavor we're getting? So things like that.
Where is the sugar extraction most efficient? Is it the soaking and mixing, or is it the spraying afterwards?
Exactly. Yeah.
What kind of?
Not only sugar, it's also other proteins that we're talking about, because that has got the flavor implication.
So you're saying that even down the line, after fermentation and a couple of distillations, dilution, aging, and then potentially further dilution, can we identify, are there identifiable characters
created by these processes?
Yeah.
100%. There are. So these are why.
So give me an example. So let's imagine let's go with the two extremes. So you've got the extreme where you are only doing one sparging and it's fresh water only. And then you've got the extreme where maybe you've done 5 waters and you're holding and using that as the strike water. And using that for the next stage. Let's take those as the two extremes. What am I getting in the fresh water only? And then what am I getting in the other one?
So in a way, on the palate, you'll find the one which has got a huge amount of water that I've used has got much more malty elements. Okay, while the other one will be on the palate itself for you quite light and fruity. Yeah. So this is what we were.
So maltier, like a heavier, thicker flavor, or
Heavier, thicker flavor. I would be easily to explain to you in beer because we drink beer quite a lot. And if you think about a lager, which has got very light, fruity, easy drinking lager, compared to some of the what do you call German lagers, which is quite malty. They're both lagers,
yeah,
but one is very malty, one is very light. Yeah, so like Peroni versus a Pilsner, if you think in that way.
yeah, or Czech, some of the Czech beers.
Yeah, so the very malty flavor that is coming through, while compared to it is a very light.
Yeah, I mean, some of those Czech beers are almost like a meal.
Yeah, so those are the ones that is where they've used much more heavier malt.
Right.
But I'm saying that flavor-wise, you can understand the difference in whiskey if they have more amount of sparge waters.
Okay, so that's where it's coming from, right at the beginning of the process.
Yes,
if you've
I
got
think,
that
I think
kind of
huge amount of
extreme.
maltiness can come from there. Yeah.
Okay, so what else through the is that the key to distillery character, or is there more that comes through?
It's one of the variables that you control to create flavor. One of the variables.
What are the others?
Listen, in brewing though, I did skip the brewing quite a lot. I say temperature profiling. Majority of the breweries will do, just single mashing temperature. For example, you're hitting towards 67 because it gives a variety.
67 degrees centigrade.
Celsius, yeah. So your strike water will be almost like around 71 degrees Celsius. That temperature depends which time of the year, because if your grain is cooler during winter, you want the temperature to be a little bit higher. But in the summer, if the grain is already at 20 degrees Celsius, you do not want to have that water too high, because your what you call mash temperature is what you're aiming for, between 65 to 67, because the enzymes that actually break down starch to sugar, their effective temperature is around 63, one of them, another is 71, and there are a few other enzymes all throughout. Now the brewers, what they do, they control that based on all the different kind of sugars that you can make. When starch is broken down, it produces not only sucrose, it produces maltotriose, dextrins, and all these things based on what enzyme has worked on it. Now, yeast do not consume all of them readily. Okay, different yeast has got the potential of eating these different sugars and producing different kind of flavors. So how you're brewing it and what all sugars you're producing in your wort is very important on the flavor. So this is why distilleries go for a standard mash, for example, which will break almost majority of the sugars into simple sugars, and you have a standard mash. But us, what we do, we start at a lower temperature because we want to create some dextrins, we want to create some maltotriose and other different sugars, which actually creates a different kind of flavors. For breweries, it creates a different kind of mouthfeel as well, other than flavors as well. So if you do a mashing at a higher temperature, there's a lot of sugars and dextrins left in your beer which doesn't get consumed by the brewing yeast, which gives a lot of body, right? Now in distilling, if you think, it will give a lot of caramelized flavors because those sugars then will caramelize during distillation. So there are a lot of ways you can create flavor in there by deciding how much sugars do you want to be left in your wort. Yeah. Now, traditionally, distilling, brewing is only to convert the starch to sugar, so sugar can be converted to alcohol. So the aim is to convert all the starch to sugar and then sugar to alcohol.
Yeah.
So you've got very little of the sugars left.
So it's an efficiency point.
Exactly.
Because at the end, what we want to do is distill out the alcohol.
Exactly. So, but for us, we decide that for a particular whiskey, we want to retain some sugar in it because we want the caramelization to happen in there because it adds the sweet caramelly, sometimes burnt element of the caramel note in our new make. So that is also another point, that how you brew, what temperature, what sugar profile you're creating has an impact on the flavor. These are noticeable ones. So this is why we have those controls over there. Then,
and it's worth saying, I mean, this is, I assume this is not unique to what you are doing. I mean, there are others that take this level of interest and that are doing it, and
it's becoming more and more popular because now a lot more breweries are getting involved in creating distilleries. So they are the ones I will hope, work on those things. Yeah.
And is it something? So I mean, we're obviously in England. We're south of the Scottish border, so there's a natural tendency to think about what's happening here. But what about in other countries like Australia and part of Australia, Tasmania, has got an incredible craft distilling thing going on. Japan, Taiwan, the US, Canada. Are there any of those other countries where you kind of feel like where this is thematic?
I think the countries which uses more of adjuncts, that is thematic because
what's adjunct? Sorry, what?
So malt. Adjuncts means something that is used to add more sugar to the solution.
Right. Okay.
Okay. But adjuncts also add flavors. For example, corn or maize has always been considered as an adjunct because it's not malt, so it goes into the grain whiskey production. The moment you use adjuncts apart from malt, you have a different cooking profile or brewing profile because many adjuncts need cooked at a high temperature. So if you think in Scotland as well, some distilleries had this brewing profiling things, but that is mainly in the grain sector. This is why you don't see much flavors or what is it creating from those different brewing things, because they are finally stripped down to make their whiskies because it goes in blend. But if you think about in America, they use a lot of corn, they use a lot of rye. There, a lot of these things are practiced because they are handling those kind of grains, and brewing profiling is required to handle those adjuncts. That's why. So many times it's process requirement, but it adds that complexity of flavor. So yeah, I have seen in other countries that they're doing it. This is why we said we need to do it. We just don't want to rely on a distilling, but a traditional distilling brew house. But many countries still follow the Scotch whisky traditions. Okay, so that's why they only have a Lauterton. There, they are a bit restricted in that way because if you think about Lauterton, how it works, or it mashed into Lauterton, there is no heating available in Lauterton. So you doing a temperature profiling is a bit difficult. So many distilleries, many countries, for example, Japan, I have not seen they're practicing brewing profiling. I've seen that they're practicing different fermentation temperatures. Okay, they're practicing different kind of distillations. Okay, because brewing is not the only parameters, right? There are other things that we'll be discussing later on. So those are there, but brewing profile wise, it's only the countries who are using different adjuncts that they practice.
Interesting. So that brings us on actually. Okay, so let's imagine you're in an environment where you don't have the ability, but it's it's not usual to play around with brewing profile. Mm-hmm. How then can you influence a distillery character?
So next comes to our next part is the fermentation. So the temperature of fermentation, long or short fermentation, all these things, and actually in the brewing, the cloudiness of the wort. These are the things that you can influence, which is typically used in the traditional brew house, a traditional distillery, to influence distillery character. So for example, some distillery will only do clear wort. Now when I say clear wort, it means when you're collecting the wort from the Lauterton, it is recycled till you reach a particular clarity in color before it goes with the fermenter. Now that clarity means there is more proteins, and there is more lipids going into the fermentation. And those lipids, what it does, it creates a different flavor profile. So the clearer the wort it is, the cleaner, grassier your spirit is going to be. Cloudier the wort, you get more nuttier, heavy, oily kind of wort and the flavor profile from that. So you control that. Fermentation time, if you have a longer fermentation, it creates fruitier wash. If you're shorter fermentation, much more heavy. I would say less fruitier.
So what's a short fermentation?
You're talking about between 36 to 48 hours.
48.
Mm.
Who's doing 48 hours?
There's multiple distilleries.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
To 48
So
hours.
2 days.
Yeah.
And what's a long fermentation?
So I've seen traditional distilleries practicing up to 105-hour fermentations. But for us,
I can't do the maths. What's that? 105/20. It's less than less
So
than
4
5
days.
days. Yeah.
Yeah,
4
4
days,
days.
yeah.
4 days fermentation.
That feels to me like the norm.
Yeah, 4 to 4.5 days. They
Most
typically-
people say 4 days.
Yeah, but most of the big distilleries, more traditional distilleries, if they're doing 105 to 110 fermentation, that is mainly due to they work 5 days a week, and during the weekends it goes for another 2 days of fermentation. That's why. But many distilleries also practice 5 days, and now it's becoming again, because of the small distilleries practicing longer fermentation, because breweries do longer fermentation because they want to control the amount of flavor that they create.
Well, that is their flavor. I mean, that
Exactly.
that
So
is
everything-
it, basically. You know,
Everything they do is to achieve what we call the
that's
wash.
their last chance.
Yes.
To create something that
Yeah.
you know,
So
with a character.
what we call a wash, for them, that's the product.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Or a winery, same.
yeah.
Well, depends if they then cask it, but
But there was a paper in 1980s where people started looking into longer fermentations, and what they found, the influence of lactic acid bacteria and other bacteria started growing in a longer fermentation, and its attributes in the fermentation, because all those bacteria, what it does, it start consuming the ethanol and other esters which is there and create secondary flavors. Okay, so long chain flavors as well, so you get more fruity, heavy fruity flavors coming through by a slow long fermentation. So
what's the longest as a
Uh,
standard practice for somebody? Do you know?
I would not be able to answer, but apart from us, what we do is 168 hours. Is what
Yeah,
we
it's
use.
pretty long, isn't it? I haven't, as I go around all the, the various distilleries, I mean, I haven't really heard anybody going beyond 7.
Mhm. So
And most people are at 4.
yeah. Most people are 4, yes.
I mean, I think there's an efficiency point as well, right?
I've seen another distillery in Scotland. They were doing that was experimental series of theirs, where it took them around, I think, 3 weeks fermentation.
Yeah.
Where they're trialing.
One question that immediately jumps out when we talk about, okay, well, there's a program of work efficiency to being 4 days, a practical element to it. The immediate thing that jumps out at me is going back to the brewing stage and creating all of those other sugars that perhaps the yeast don't act on, or more traditional, straightforward yeast don't act on. Is there an element where you might say, if you're not doing a brewing profile where you're creating those additional sugars, there is no point in going beyond 4 days because you're not going to get anything else? Or does that come into play? Does your brew profile have any influence on the value of going longer or shorter in the fermentation?
It is much more complex than that, I think. Is you can still have a simple standard distiller's brewing profile, and you'll have influence of
You're
the
still
length of the
going,
fermentation.
okay, fine.
Yes, yeah.
So fermentation very definitely got an influence on distillery character. What about distillation?
So that is the last part, I think, where you can influence when the wash distillation.
I feel like that's the one where it's like if you're going on a standard tour of a distillery is the one where, you know, it's the easiest to point at a pot still and say this is where this is different and this is where the flavor comes from.
Yeah, so I think that's what most of the people do because it's much more easier to explain
Yeah.
than the brewing side because you can't really see much.
Yeah.
So yes, there's huge influence in there, both in the wash distillation and the spirit distillation. For example, wash distillation is, how long you do it for, you're letting the browning reaction happen there. Browning reaction is not going to happen in the spirit distillation.
What is a browning reaction?
So it's called the Maillard reaction. So if there is proteins and sugars and the yeast, which is in the wash that is left. So in the distilling world, we transfer all the fermentation content into the wash still, right? That is including this yeast sedimenting at the bottom. Now that the yeast is thoroughly cooked during distillation, and it releases certain flavors. Yeast has got amino acids. The amino acids reacts with the alcohol. That alcohol reacts with other esters. There's a lot of complex addition and subtraction reaction, what we call it. Subtraction reactions are longer flavor molecules, gets broken down into simpler flavor molecules. Addition reactions is pretty much like formation of esters with acid and alcohol reacting together. So all these things, it's a very complex process. So if you do a really quick wash distillation, all those processes do not really have enough time to happen, okay? But you have got high temperature. So browning, for example, when you're baking a bread, the temperature of baking the bread, it creates a different kind of color on your bread, right? So some are very light color because you have only baked at 80. But if you want a really brown crust on it, you just crack up the heat. So the Maillard happens and you have got this really sweet caramelly flavor. That's the same thing happening in the wash distillation as well. So right, if you crack up the heat, do the distillation really quickly, you get browning reactions and all these flavors, but the very less of those addition reactions is happening. But if you do a really gentle, slow, long distillation, you get more fruitier flavors forming, but not enough browning reactions are happening. For that needs higher temperature, let's say.
So browning is or Maillard, is that a caramelization?
So Maillard reaction, it's not only one reaction, there's a huge amount of reaction happening together to create that flavor. So Maillard reaction is usually talked about in bread making or baking, where you can see that reaction happening.
What is Maillard
It's a scientist.
A person
scientist
who characterized it first, identified it. Okay.
Yeah.
When did that happen? Do you know when that was discovered?
I cannot remember. Yeah.
Curious. All right, but you talked about, literally used the word browning, and in the context of bread, you talked about it kind of, there being a different color, but the low wines don't have a color.
No. What I mean is like those browning, when you smell a bread which has been baked to brown and very lightly baked, when you smell it, you see the smell difference. Not you see, you can sense this difference in smell. Anything that you can smell like that is going to get carried over to your low wine. So how you distill the low wine will create different kind of flavor molecules that get into the low wines. So that is why the rate of distillation is quite important in there as well. Another thing is, now we are sitting here, that's perfect, is if you see our wash still, Sandy, the line arm, which is connecting the swan neck into the condenser, it is ascending, which means it's going up in an angle. Now, what it does, it actually...
Did you just explain to me what the word ascending means?
No,
come on.
No, why?
I know I'm a novice, but
no, but then
English I can do.
No, the direction of the line arm had to be clarified. Many times I feel when you say ascending, which way is it ascending? Is it coming to the still or going away from the still?
All right, okay, fair enough.
So that way I'm saying it is ascending towards the condenser.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So ascending is an ascending line arm, and also we have got what we call a glass.
All right, okay, wait. So tell me, why is that important?
I'm getting to it. So along with it, with the lamp glass, we have got a high amount of copper surface area. and copper loses heat very quickly. So what it means, we have got this ascending line arm and a ball neck. It increases the copper contact, loses the heat, creates high amount of reflux. The more and more reflux that you have, there are certain more chemical reactions happening in the vapor. One most important thing is sulfur reduction. Now, sulfur is produced naturally by yeast. Okay, it's a byproduct. If you reduce the sulfur, it actually pushes the other fruitier flavors to shine more. So if you do a slower distillation, your products are much more fruitier than if you do a quick distillation.
So reflux basically just means the liquid is condensing back. Sorry, the vapor is condensing back to liquid, probably in that line arm.
Yeah.
And then going back down into the still.
Falling
and
back
that
to the
is
still.
reflux.
Yeah, exactly.
And the amount of reflux governs effectively the number of times that those molecules of ethanol attached to other things are going to go up through the neck and into the line arm, where they're getting loads of copper contact, which is purifying them, stripping out the sulfur elements.
Yes.
Which is allowing the other flavors to shine through.
Yeah.
And probably taking out some other things like some of the feel to it, or altering the way that the mouthfeel or
Absolutely, yeah. So
oils and
there are other oils, and also what the reflux also does. Yeast also produces heavy oils and congeners, right? So some of those heavy oil, like very oily, sharper flavors actually stays back if you have a really long, high reflux distillation. So
okay, so that's interesting. I mean, that's still that's pretty unusual, isn't it? I mean, most of the ones that I've seen have a descending. That means going down.
Yes.
Line arm as it comes away from the still itself to the condenser.
There are varied angled stills in the industry, and that also adds to the distillery character. So, and also many of them were found, how it's adding to the flavor to the distillery. For example, one of the ones that you might have seen, which is iconic, is Macallan stills. Has got very short, still dumpier stills descending line arm. Because what their ethos is, they're creating all these flavors. They want to capture all the oily elements and all these things, because their maturation policy is all 100% sherry casks, and sherry cask gives a lot of flavor. So therefore, their distillery character shine through. They need to capture all those things and put it in there, so that the cask doesn't overpower it.
I see. So they need a punchy
Very
new
punchy
make,
new makes, yeah.
because the cask might otherwise overshadow it.
Yeah.
And while we're on stills, well, perhaps it's worth coming back to that second distillation. I guess the same principle applies.
Same principle applies
in the context of a pot still.
Yeah.
But then, at this distillery, we've got something that Americans would recognize, which is that hybrid still that you see a lot in the bourbon distilleries, or you see in the bourbon distilleries. And what how is that in the context of that the hybrid with the column? How would you describe that process in the context of that still?
Yeah, so for
adding and it creating the kind of character that it's going to give, and we see that character in bourbon in particular, right?
Yeah, so why we said we need a hybrid still, or the creating a particular flavor in hybrid still, is you have got the control where you can select the flavors that you want to retain and to create a lighter style you make, very light, approachable, so that it do not need long maturation time. Now, heavier congeners, it goes through further development during maturation. Now, let's consider that it is not wood, but it is a breathing membrane, okay? And wood is not adding any flavor. The oils, the congeners that the yeast has produced, that we have now selected through distillation, It's in the barrel. Now that goes through further addition and subtraction reaction during its maturation period because of the oxygen slowly being given to it. So if you have got a higher congenial whiskey new make, that takes longer period to mature to become that softer element, right? But if you can strip down some of those heavy oily compounds, your maturation time could be reduced, right? Now, if you do not have any of these oily compounds, then you can drink it straight out of distillation. So that is the concept of selection or doing the second distillation. How much of those flavors do you want to retain in your new make? And by selecting that, you're creating different styles of new make. That's what we employ using our hybrid still. Right? So we said we're going to have a new make that has got really heavy oily characters, which is through our pot distilled single malt, or through our column distilled, hybrid column distilled single malt. We create much more lighter elements where it is mainly, for example, mainly shining the malt character, okay, retaining only the fruitier notes that the yeast has to give rather than the heavier oily compounds as well. So that's what we do over there. And also it has a huge amount of copper contact. So that means we're almost negating any influence by sulfur that has been produced by yeast.
So, so then we've got our new make spirit. Is that where distillery character ends? Is that the end of distillery character, the new make, or can a distillery claim a distillery character to their whiskey beyond new make? So with the type of cask they're using, or the nature of how they blend the casks, or and maybe the aging or anything like that. Would you say that those are contributors to distillery character?
Sure.
And are there any that really jump out? I mean, you've already mentioned one.
Yeah, so there is a few distilleries who give very little, draws very little attention to their rest of the production process, but hugely rely on the casks that they use. Say this is the cask character and this is what we stand for. We want to do 100% sherry cask. So I have seen few distilleries do that. So that can add distillery character to them, and that defines their process. Okay. Well, I'm a big fan of Macallan. I think for them it is not only the cask, because what they have also seen and showed it to the industry as well, that the cask selection that they select, okay, certainly gives some elements to the flavor, but it's the maturation process afterwards. So by the time, let's say 5 years, their whiskey, they're all 100% sherry cask matured, right? Is not only finished. And they have shown it through their products that by 5 years plus, what you're getting is not the influence of the cask, it's the influence of the maturation. It's, what I just said, if you can think the wood out, and then the addition and subtraction reaction happening with those oils inside, that, so for a company like Macallan, that is what they're trying to show. We create our distillery process by these processes, having a still, dumping a still, catching everything, and then putting into this cask, and we then create through longer maturation these particular flavors in that way. While other people also say that some only uses Oloroso cask and that's their style. Some people say, it's going to be different kind of sherry casks and then finished in another cask. So there are a few distilleries who rely only just talking about cask and the processes that you do during maturation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a practical element as well, isn't there? Like it's almost a risk. If I kind of come at it from a business perspective, or a product management perspective, that if you were starting out as we did 8 years ago, and you built your distillery character on cask type, well, unless you own a bodega in in sherry country, or somewhere else where you can guarantee that you're going to get those casks
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to be, consistent, then it's a little bit out of your control. I mean, it sounds silly to say that, but in a way, if you define your distillery character based on the distillation, fermentation, brewing, grain selection, those are all variables more or less within your control, unless there's a weather event that means you can't get the grain. But which is quite interesting.
Yeah, it is, and I think those distilleries focuses hugely on their cask supply chain. Their main focus is having the partnership with people, long-term relationship, because they know, as you said, that is
their taste.
The thing. Without their distillery character is going to fall through.
It's really interesting what you said about maturation. I mean, while I was somewhere else and at a distillery overseas, and they said that one of their really, really popular visitor experiences was a maturation masterclass.
Mm-hmm.
And we obviously do here that we do the whiskey blending masterclass, which is amazing and hugely popular. But it did make me think, actually, there is a whole thing around maturation, particularly, if you've got a new make that you can drink, and you can show how that whiskey kind of develops over the 3, 4 and beyond years. That it's a non-linear process, and various things are happening along the way. It is fascinating, but certainly if you make that then part of your distillery character, that's quite
and also
unusual,
when I think the maturation process, many distillery also practice post maturation called marrying process. Because all these casks are mature in a different way. They need to mingle together, to come together to form a whiskey. For us also, that marrying process is very important. This is why, even if it is when I say marrying, it's the post-maturation in a cask, the time it takes, okay? Because many times people say, if it's a single cask, how do you marry? I was like, right, that's why using the word marry is not right. It's a post-maturation, the processing that you need. So for us also, that part is quite important. Once we make our whiskey, some of the whiskeys can take 6 to 8 weeks before we say, right, it is time to bottle it. The moment we reach that, we bottle it, okay? But some whiskeys take 3 weeks. But all depends on the container that we created during fermentation, okay? Depends on the sugar that we created during brewing, and depends on how we distilled.
Yeah.
So they are also linked together to the maturation and into the final resting period, where it becomes the whiskey that you're capturing in the bottle.
And you've just reminded me, actually, we kind of we jumped over a whole question, which, if you're at Michter's, for example, which I love Michter's. They have, I think, 6 principles of how they make whiskey and what is their distillery character. Or Peerless, another amazing Kentucky bourbon. They both share an emphasis on one element that we haven't talked about, and I know is important to us, but and I wonder whether that is something that defines distillery character, and that is the barreling strength. So I think Michter's, they do everything in proof, so if you divide it by 2, but I'm pretty sure it was 56% ABV barreling strength. So what is the normal barreling strength, and what can varying the barreling strength do, and does that count as distillery character?
For us, it does forms a part that creates a distillery character. What it does, and brandy as well is a big example like that. If you mature something at lower ABV, now if you think about alcohol, it's a solvent. It dissolves particular things, and water also dissolves particular things. But if you have got a higher alcohol, you typically extract from the wood the alcohol soluble product, right? then which further breaks down and create a particular flavor profile. But when you have got lower ABV new make going into the barrel, it mainly draws the more water soluble ones, which is much more sweeter, less tannic. Alcohol extracted ones is much more tannic, bit sharper. This is why barrel strength for us is very important. We also do only very small quantity at a higher ABV, but that has its own purpose to achieve. Okay, but majority of our barrels we also fill it sub 60.
How unusual is that? I mean, I mentioned too, it feels like, I mean, as I mentioned, Michter's, that is one of their 6 principles that they say defines them,
whiskey. Yeah.
Right? That suggests that they feel it's ownable, in kind of marketing speak. Does that suggest that that's pretty unusual?
It is pretty unusual.
It certainly increases the cost, right? You need more barrels.
You need more barrels, yeah, exactly. So it is very unusual. The industry standard, at least in Scotland and other parts as well, who follows that kind of tradition, is typically 63.5. I do not know why 63.5, but it is 63.5. I still remember SWRI showing us, they did a show where they have...
Who's the SWRI?
Scotch Whisky Research Institute.
Okay.
When I was studying at Harry Watt, they did a presentation showing that how wood react at different ABVs. I think from 60 to 70 they did it, and we did a tasting. The more stronger it became, the more drier the spirit was. Yeah, so it shows how extraction of the tannins was happening and all these things. So yeah, typically 63.5, but recent years, I do not know, it may be because of the cost of the barrel, you put less alcohol in the barrels. I've seen some distilleries are filling at 69, which for me is like interesting. But yeah, people do fill at different ABVs.
I mean, I guess the other thing that has become more and more prevalent, which might allow you to do that, is then the finishing in
other casks,
which of course is not available to a Michter's, and is not something that that we have done. So
yeah.
But I guess if you're then finishing, you might if that creates sharper flavors, you might be able to round those off with.
Yeah, but when I say sharp, also tannins do help in certain way. For example,
but is it body?
It's a body, so it gives the body. So on the palate, you don't feel the alcohol strength. So if you have a higher tannin in your whiskey, comparatively higher tannin in your whiskey, and you bottle your whiskey at a higher temperature, you'll not feel that alcohol burn on your palate that much. But it will be very dry. It's like having a wine which has been matured in wood compared to a wine that has not touched wood.
Actually, you're talking about the SWI. I mean, that is something that certainly we should do. We don't do it. Michter's, in their whiskey tasting, they give you a whiskey which they don't sell, they don't make, they don't market, which was barreled at a higher ABV that they do just to show the contrast
in the flavors
of what it does. And I think it's that is a nice demonstration of kind of a commitment to they're barreling things that they're not selling, and it's just to kind of demonstrate how important
it is
to them and to their distillery character barreling at a lower ABV is, which is is quite interesting. Most people couldn't tell the difference, but pretty me included. But
no, I think for us also it's very important, and that's why I'm saying we do also practice some higher. Sometimes we said, we need something on the body element of the whiskey. Let's bring in some one of those the higher ABV ones. So it is all about for us, it's creating the distillery character. It's not about we want to be a distillery who has a brewing profile, who has got 7-day long fermentation. No, those are our keys, or as you say, the handles that we pull to create different flavors. But ours is all about the distillery character, the different flavors that you can create, rather than just become a traditional distillery.
Very good. Right. So distillery character, it's a very real thing. It's got loads of elements all the way through the process that a distillery can play with in order to achieve a certain distillery character, right the way through, basically practically until bottling, whether it's the marriage all the way through. So that's interesting.